a word to us. So, Andy, we're so glad you're here. Let's give Andy a welcome this morning.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm so glad to be here. I am honored that you would take the time on a Saturday morning in August. Some of you, Saturday morning is sacred, and I get it. And so thank you for sharing it with us right here. It means a lot, not only to me, but certainly to the Growing Younger Together committee and to the staff of this church. So I really appreciate it. As Jeremy said, my name's Andy. I am the Director of Church Engagement at Fuller Youth Institute. Fuller Youth Institute is a research center of Fuller Seminary. So Fuller Seminary is located in Pasadena, California. And we focus on research on young people meaning teenagers and young adults. So those who are in middle school, high school, college, all the way up through really about 29 or even beyond, but we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. We try to turn that research into resources that churches can use, resources and training that churches can benefit from. And so our heart is, first of all, with the young people. We want to see young people thrive in their walk with Jesus and in turn to change not only our churches but our world. But we want to see that happen through the church. And so it's really important for us. My role as a church engagement director really is important in terms of we want the church to thrive also. So that's a little bit of, well, I'll share a little bit more. How about, I was born in South Korea, so if you're wondering. Born in South Korea, moved to the United States as a 7-year-old. There's a long story of how I landed in Sanford, North Carolina. Thus, I sound like you all. Caleb, I have one of my coworkers here, a colleague, and Caleb's from Pasadena, California, where our seminary is, and so he doesn't sound like us. It's okay. You still love him anyways. But I grew up in North Carolina, went to North Carolina State University as an undergrad, so I at least wear red. I know I'm in Bulldog country, so I'm going to not go there, but I do wear red, so at least there's that, so you don't have to run me out of town just yet. And did my MDiv at Campbell Divinity School in North Carolina, and then Fuller Seminary as my doctorate. And I know churches like First Gainesville because I've grown up in churches like First Gainesville. I have served churches like First Gainesville. I've served many years as a youth minister for churches like this, and then I served as a pastor at First Baptist Church in Albemarle, North Carolina. And so I've been a lifelong Baptist, so I speak the same language that you all do, so as far as church life goes. And so I'm excited to be here to share this information with you all. And you being here today tells me that you care about this church, and you care about young people. And that to me is so exciting that you would take your time to be here. So I want to go ahead and get started with Growing Young. This is, I'll talk a little bit about the research in just a few minutes, but imagine that this sanctuary that we're sitting in right now is filled with young people, ages 15 to 29. Imagine that there's the doors in the back are always open because young people are flooding into the sanctuary. and they're not leaving out the back door just as quickly as they're entering into the sanctuary. Imagine the vibrancy, imagine the excitement, the energy that would create. Imagine what it would be like if young people were taking leadership roles in the church. Imagine what it would be like if young people were leading and serving and relating with all generations. Imagine what it would be like. Because my heart and my mind and our research tells us that it can happen. It is happening. Not everywhere, but it is happening. And what we hope for here at First Baptist Gainesville is that will continue to happen here at this church. And that's the heart in which the Growing Younger Together Committee has been formed, and that's the heart that we have together as a church family. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here this morning. Or you may be here thinking, what is this? And I'm going to go find out. I get that. But I hope that you're here because you love the church and you love the young people in it. Unfortunately, we hear comments like this. Connor, who's age 15, when we asked him, what do you think about? When do you think about God? And the comment is, the only time I think about God was when I'm at church. And that's not what we desire to hear from our young people. We want faith to be so deep. We want faith to be so vibrant in our young people that they are thinking about how they are connected with God and have a relationship with God in a every day of life, not just on Sundays and not only when they're here in this building. So for the next few moments, I'm going to do what this slide tells us. Max Dupree is a business leader. Max Dupree is a former trustee of Fuller Seminary. And he said this before he passed. He said, the first job of leaders is to define reality. And so for the next little while, I'm going to define some reality from our research that I want to share with you all about our young people. Research tells us that 1 out of 2 young people drift from their faith. Here's what we mean by that. In our research at Sticky Faith that came out about 12 years ago now, we studied young people as they were graduating from high school and going off to college or to work or wherever they may be going, and we've tracked their faith development after high school graduation. And what we found was that within the first 18 months of graduation, 1 out of 2, we're not talking about just any young people in the community. We're talking about those that would graduate from places like First Baptist Gainesville. The ones that we would celebrate on that graduation recognition service. Remember that just a few months ago? Where we walked and celebrated the accomplishments of our young people, which we should. Don't hear me wrong. Those young people, 1 out of 2, will drift away from their faith within the first 18 months. Now, I will put the caveat here is that these are statistics. This is research. We're looking at it from 30,000-foot perspective, right? So we can always say with research, well, I know so-and-so. I know this person. And there's always going to be, we know that person. But if we look at it in the big picture, this is what we're finding. We're also finding that 2 out of the 3 who drop out, 2 out of the 3 drop out between the ages of 18 to 23. So you got half that drop out between the first 18 months, and then you have some additional attrition after that. We also know that there's no major Christian tradition that is growing in the United States today, including ours, the Baptist. All right? The share of U.S. adults who identify as Christians continue to decrease. In 2009, that was 77% in the United States. 2019, that number declined to 65%. And so that's a decline of 12% in just the span of 10 years. That's pretty quick. And that's pretty substantive. The share of U.S. adults who are religiously unaffiliated continues to increase. So we in the research world call these the nuns, not the N-U-N, nuns of our Catholic sisters, but the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those who would say that they do not profess any type of faith in the United States. And so from 2019, 17% of our population, adult population, would say, I don't have any type of faith. That number rose to, in 2019, 26%. That means that was an increase of 9%, meaning 1 out of every 4 adults in the U.S. would not profess any type of faith any longer. And certainly we're seeing this, that decreased affiliation means decreased attendance or engagement, right? Makes perfectly good sense that if you don't have faith, then you're not going to be engaged in the church community or engage your faith in any way. And what we're also seeing is that there's some generational gaps here, some generational gaps. In the silent generation, our oldest generations who are still living, almost 80% would profess to have Christian faith in the U.S. Then the next one, the boomers, that number comes down slightly to 74% who would profess to be Christians. And then we will skip the Gen Xers because I don't want to talk about myself, but we'll go directly to the millennials. And the millennials drop down all the way to 49%. You see the drop in the rate in which it's happening. And we'll talk about why that's happening in just a second. This slide will say that those who are in the age brackets of 18 to 29-year-olds in the U.S., they make up 17% of the population, but they only make up 10% of the population in the church. So think about that. They make up 17% of our population, but they only make up 10% of our population in the church. So there's a huge decrease in who's in church. Scott Kermode, who's a leadership professor at Fuller Seminary, says this, that the church is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. That sometimes churches have operated as if we're still in 1960, 1970. Those were good days, by the way. I hear. I haven't been there. Wasn't alive at that point. But I hear they were good days. But the church is calibrated for a world that doesn't exist any longer. But at Fuller Youth Institute, we don't want to dwell on those negative statistics. That's not our focus. And so what if this wasn't our story? The Big C Church, what if this wasn't our story? It doesn't have to be our story. It can be the story that I had you imagine at the beginning of our time, right? A church that's filled with young people, a church where young people are just flooding into the church to grow and to be engaged in their faith in the body of Christ. In our research, Growing Young, it's a book that we produced from our research. We define growing young churches as this: churches that aren't shrinking and aging, but are growing and involving and retaining young people. In our research, in this case, was between ages of 15 to 29, all right? Which brings overall vitality to the whole church. Overall vitality to the whole church. So the way that we went about this research is that it is an exemplar research. We went out and sought after the churches that were reaching young people well, because that's happening, okay? There are churches that are reaching and retaining young people well, and so we went after those churches to see what was it that they were doing well. And so we went through several different stages. It is a extensive process. Took over 2 years to complete the nomination. We went through some nomination process, phone interviews, and then our final stage was to do some site visits to those 12 of those churches. Again, thousands of interviews, research hours, extra reading, all of those things that went into this significant research. And what we found was, or what we pointed to, was the fact that churches that were growing young, or churches that were retaining and reaching young people well, it wasn't just about young people being the only beneficiary of that. What we found was that the church had this vitality, this energy. And so it was important that we really saw that, is that the vitality came to the whole church and not just a segment of the church. That it was about young people making the whole church better, and not just young adult ministry or youth ministry. So what does it take to reach young people today? That's the million-dollar question, right? That's the million-dollar question. I wish I had the easy answer for that. Otherwise, I'd be a millionaire. But I'm not, and there's not an easy answer for that. I'm going to start with this idea of what doesn't it take, first of all. We'll take the negative perspective here first, is qualities your church doesn't need to grow young in our research, all right? And these are the qualities. It didn't matter what size you were in order to grow young or reach young people well. It didn't matter where you were located or what part of the country you were in. It didn't matter how old your church was. How old is this church? 130, 40? No, the church has been in existence for over 150 years. Am I close enough? Yeah. So it doesn't matter whether you're 150 years old or if you're 10 years old in a strip mall. And it didn't matter what denomination you were in. That churches in our research that were reaching young people well were all across the board. So there was no significant data that would say that you had to be a certain church in order to reach young people well. And I want you to hear this and hear me well in this. Brenda, I see you. So this means that growing young isn't about doing youth ministry better. It isn't about doing just youth ministry better. Should we always do ministry better? Yes, absolutely. Right? But it isn't about just fixing one area of our church. We're increasing one area of our church. Growing young is about shifting the church culture. And that's what we found in our research, is that it was really about shifting our church attitudes and mindset. How we thought about one another, how we saw each other, how we acted toward one another. So what does it take to reach young people? In our research, we found 6 things that came to the top as we researched all of these churches. 6 qualities that rose to the top, and we call these the 6 core commitments. Right? So these are the things that our research has said that reaches young people well. And we put it in a nice little graphic here, and it's what we call the Growing Young Wheel. So if you start at the 1 o'clock hour, it's the Keychain leadership, empathy, taking Jesus' message seriously, warm relationships in the church, prioritizing young people and their families everywhere, and being good neighbors. I'll talk a little bit about those in just a few minutes. But none of it matters if we don't have what's in the middle, right? It always begins with Jesus. It always ends with Jesus. If we don't start with Jesus, then we don't have anything. So we have to start with Jesus in a Jesus-centered community, a church that cares about being serious of becoming lifelong followers of Jesus. And then it also matters that we put everything into the context. Context of this church, context of this community, that what happens in Pasadena, California doesn't matter to what happens here in Georgia, in Gainesville. You can't take what some church down the road is doing well here and try to do it over here and think that that's going to solve our issues. It always has to be contextualized within this church, this body. And so our Growing Young will shows that it begins with Jesus. It's within the context of where we find ourselves and these 6 core commitments. Now, you see this little dot that goes over to the side and it says growing old. That's a bit of an important piece in this Growing Young will, is that we can do all of those other things, the Keychain leadership, empathy, Jesus message, warm relationships, being good neighbors. We can do all of those things well, but if we don't prioritize young people and their families in our decisions and what we do as a church and how we move forward, we can do all of those other things pretty well, but then if we don't intentionally think about how does this impact young people, then we found that the church continues to grow older. Now let me stop right here. Many of you all are more experienced than I am. Growing young isn't just placating and focusing on young people. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to pay attention to people of all generations in the church, right? It doesn't mean, it actually means the exact opposite. It means that we all generations in this room, we all need to be invited into this process, to be part of the church the way the church should be. Right now, we're trying to address a need in this church and in the community. The need is that we're seeing young people less and less in the pews, not only of this church, but churches all across the country. And so please don't leave here thinking, oh, we're just going to focus on young people and the older people don't matter here. Please don't tell Jeremy, don't send him that email, because that is not what we're saying here. What we're saying is we're inviting every generation to be a part, because we're addressing a need that we see in our church culture. And that need is that we're missing a couple of generations from the pews in a big picture way. Pope Francis is a different kind of pope. He has really turned the Catholic Church upside down in so many ways. But I love what Pope Francis says here. The path of preparation for this moment has highlighted a church that needs to listen, including those young people who often do not feel understood by the church in their originality and therefore not accepted for who they really are and sometimes even rejected. We have the opportunity, the task, and the duty to be a sign of a church that really listens, that allows herself to be questioned by the experiences of those she meets, and who does not always have a ready-made answer. I know we're not the Catholic Church, but I think that's pretty right on for all churches. For all churches. Again, growing young. Churches that aren't shrinking and aging, but growing and involving and retaining young people ages 15 to 29, which brings overall vitality to the church. Overall vitality to the church. And that's our hopes and dreams. That's why you've asked Fuller Youth Institute to come and help and to walk alongside you in this journey. I'll stop right here for just a few moments for questions. I just threw a lot of stuff at you. So what questions might you have? And Caleb is going to come and run around and share a microphone if you would like to ask a question. Got the first one right there. Yeah, sorry.
Nope.
Yep,
There
we go.
I just want to know if all these statistics are in the book that you talk about.
Most of them are. We have added some more since the book, but most of them are. We are continually doing research and continually looking at other people's research and making sure that it continues to align with what we found in order to keep it up to date and fresh. So, yes, most of them are. Yes, sir.
I have a comment about the 15 to 29-year-olds and a question. The 15 to 29-year-olds bring vitality to us both inside and outside of the church. The more that we're around 29-year-olds and 15-year-olds and 17-year-olds, the more that we're alive as people over 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 in some cases.
Yeah.
But my question is, do you find that there was more resistance to the churches being able to grow young that were 150 years old like our church versus the church that met in a new church in a metal building that had a rock band that had all of those things going for it right from the very beginning?
So we're going to go there first. Well, let's just address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is a building like this, with a stage like this, with pyramids that look like this, and a worship style that Mark leads in choir, and wonderful music. Will that be attractive to our young people? Is that or detrimental? So here's what our research tells us, and actually this kind of jumps the gun a little bit, but we'll go there now, is that what our research tells us, yes, initial attractiveness, some of the more modern music is initially more attractive to young people. That's our research, so I won't speak against that. But what our research also tells us is that when we ask young people what matters to them about church, music style comes all the way down here. All the way down here. What matters is it feel like family? Relationships. Number one answer. Always. Am I accepted there? And then, what are we doing in the community? Are we getting outside the walls of the church? Are we getting outside of the pews? Are we taking Jesus' message seriously? So the teaching and the education of the church is important. It's like comes down to number 6 in our research. So does it matter? Yes, in some sense, but does it really matter? Not above most other things. And so I think that's important to understand, is that what we found was that reaching young people well didn't necessarily go toward programming. No program, no kind of what the church does per se had a significant impact. What mattered the most was how were young people engaged and welcomed into the space and to be part of the body of Christ. We'll talk more about that, so we'll come back to that. Yes, I think we had one there, and then we had, go there.
Of your 259 churches mentioned within the survey
Yes.
research, where were they? Nationwide, localized, California?
Right. So the research was done. We are very intentional about research being done from all regions of the country, all different denominations, all ethnicities. And so we make sure that we are very broad in our research. So it's all over the country. And so this is not, I know what we think. If it comes out of California, we got to go, huh? See, I know. I know. But our research is pretty broad and pretty significant, so yes.
Thank you.
We have the other one, and then,
Handheld one.
yeah, there's one more.
Thank you so much for being with
Yep.
us this weekend. Thank you for your time. To me, the most concerning numbers that you have shown were not necessarily about youth and young adults falling away from the church during those college years. It was the desire to not come back. That's what I feel. I really believe throughout time, there has been a fall away when students go to college, when they get into the workforce.
Yeah.
But there always seemed like historically there was a desire, when I have kids, I'm bringing them back to church. And that's what I see as almost counterculture now, that there is enough opportunities, and I'll say on Sunday, for parents to be involved with their kids away from church. And that's what I'm most eager to hear you talk about, is that bringing them back. Is historically, I do think there's always been a drift during those years. But it was, even when I was perfect during college myself, but I knew some people.
I was too.
I knew some people. You went to an ACC school, you had to be.
That's
It
right.
was a lot stronger Christian base. As we drifted away during those times, but when we came back, but there was always, I'm a Christian, I'm going to church, I'm going to be at church. I don't see that nowadays. I see that I've cut the strings, I don't have to come back. So that's where I want to make that connection with some of our students as they leave, is that they may leave, but it's a bungee cord. You're still connected. You're still connected. You may not be in this town, you may not be there, but there's a connection, and that's what I'm most eager to hear about, how we dream.
Yeah, and so very astute in terms of that. That traditionally, we sow our wild oats in college years, get married, have family, and we return back to church. And we're seeing, does that still happen? Yes, some of that still happens. Is it a much less percentage? Yeah, it's much lower, those folks. Others. I'll take a couple more, and then we'll keep going.
Is this okay? So my question is whether or not you notice changes after the young people come in, with all their originality, and who they are, bringing themselves. And so how do you then have the older people thinking, I need to get out of here and go find a church where things are more the way I always trusted they would be?
No, because what we're advocating for and what we saw in our research is that young people need all generations around them. If you're in the 70, 80-year-old range, all right, bless you for your faithfulness and your willingness to be here this morning, and your faithfulness to this church and to Jesus. Our young people need you. Our young people need you. Not just your dollars. That's good too. Right, Jeremy? That's good too. But they need you invested in their lives. We always refer it to as not only knowing their names, but knowing them well enough that you know their joys and their pains. Think about that for a second. Knowing them well enough that you know their joys and their pains. They're not going to share those things with you if they don't do what? If they don't trust you. If you don't have a relationship with them, you're not going to get those from them. So it's not about just knowing names, but it's about spending time and investing in young people's lives. This is not new, right? This is relationships. This is church. This is what we're called to do as the body of Christ. The eye and the ear and the hand and the foot. It's pretty scriptural. Don't get me preaching now.
And I guess mine kind of goes with that, but it's I don't know how to explain, but do you see when you put up the graphic about the Jesus-centered church?
Yeah.
I know as the different generations, I think that's a very different perspective in each generation. How do you see that reconciling itself within a church?
Tell me more about how that looks a little different from generation to generation.
I think just the willingness to incorporate different parts of the Bible and the belief system about what the Bible is, I think, is different within each generation. And I think that when you start talking about Jesus-centered, to me, I think that may mean something very different to my dad. And I think how do you see that reconciling itself?
So I think I'm getting where you're going with that. So the person of Jesus doesn't change, right? Jesus' message doesn't change, what we find in Scripture. How we might apply those may look different. And for some younger generations, that means less about sitting in the pews and more about being out there, maybe more, I'll use this word of inclusiveness of all people. And so what we found in our research is this. Again, we asked our young people that we talked to about this, is that they don't have to agree. They didn't have to agree with where the church stood on certain biblical social issues. They didn't have to agree with the church. What they had to have was a place where they felt safe to talk about it, to have a conversation, to say, I don't know that I see it that way. I think I interpret it differently here. But to be a safe place to do that and not be shut down because they think maybe something different.
Discussion about your personal relationship with Christ.
Yeah, to have an openness, and the safety is the important part, right? The safety of being able to express your doubts, express your fears, express the differences, and not be judged because of that. Does that help? Does that make sense? Yeah. And that's what we found in the research. One more, we'll go, and then we'll keep going.
Yeah, out of all the churches that you took data on, how many of those churches were, for lack of a better way of putting it, an older church that transitioned to a church that had brought in a younger population, and what were the steps and what was the plan or the plans, the commonalities of those churches that they actually accomplished it? Because I think that's one of the things we're
Yeah.
trying to do here.
Right. So there wasn't one single or even two or three that looked the same. And I think what we're going after is this idea of these characteristics within the whole church, the 6 core commitments, is what brought young people engaged in the church. And not a specific, all right, we got to have this, because we saw it in all different types of churches. All different types of churches. So there wasn't a bottom baseline of if a church has X, Y, and Z programming or X, Y, and Z look or X, Y, and Z of certain things. There wasn't a commonality of all of those.
But what were the commonalities?
Yeah, so the core commitments were the commonalities. Kind of it's the principles of the gathering of the base, the body of Christ having these principles within the church. Those were the commonalities that grew, that rose to the top, that we're going to be talking about here. The commonalities of the churches that didn't make didn't have the core commitments. Older church, less young people in the church. I mean, that's what it ended up. I mean, those were the results of that. I don't know if I'm answering your question properly there.
We're trying to talk about these with the principles.
Yeah.
Or the commonalities amongst these churches that have made this transition. Well, as an example, what if there's churches that haven't made that transition that have those same principles, right? So you're looking at 6 different principles, whatever. These all have the commonality of it, but are there other places out there that haven't made that transition that always do? Or what are those commonalities in churches that haven't?
Yeah, so it's the opposite of what the 6 core commitments talk about, right? It's the churches are not sharing leadership with young people. The churches are pretty separated and not There's a difference between multi-generational churches and an intergenerational church. Just because you have multi-generations in the room doesn't mean that there's any kind of relationship that's happening between those generations. Intergeneration churches have relationships between the different generations. So it's kind of the opposite of what we're going to be talking about. Is what we find in those churches who aren't growing young. Okay. Just trying to decide. Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break. Let's take a 10-minute break. Everybody can probably use a little time. Don't forget, there's coffee and drink and donuts in the parlor. Go and take a short break. Stand up. And walk around a little bit. Thank you. Jeremy's not listening, and this is really not about Jeremy, but what's one word to describe the church's leadership culture? One word to describe the leadership culture of the church. This is not about just Jeremy. I'm talking about in general. Mixed. The same. Okay. So what? Same people. Mixed in what?
Mixed in styles and effectiveness of leadership.
Styles and effectiveness of leadership. Yes. Okay. Other words. Acceptance.
Real quick, leadership is paid or volunteer or both?
Both. Yeah, just the leadership style of the whole church.
Should it always be loving?
Loving. I didn't ask what it should be. What is it? We'll leave it right there. Okay. We'll leave it right there. Others. Any other words?
I think in the past, maybe it's been top down. I think that we're changing that
Yeah. Top down, but it's being shifted a little bit, okay? Confusion.
When you're in that time of change.
So if there's a time of kind of transition, there's confusion in the transition, all right? We didn't seek after this part. This was not what we thought we were going to find in our research. But as we got into our research, what we found was that 3/4 of our people that we talked to pointed to leadership of the church. Again, this is not just paid leadership. This is not just the ministerial staff, but leadership of the church as one of the primary needs or reasons why young people engage in the church. Leadership is something that was important to them. Now, that's going to have different meanings in just a second. But what we found was that there's a big myth in the church that you need to look like or have the characteristics of a young, hip leader. I don't know about you, but I am not that person. Jeremy's young, and he's pretty hip. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. We won't we won't describe Jeremy right now. But the myth is that you have to have a certain type of leader in order to really attract and engage young people well, right? And that is truly a myth. Now, certainly in our research, we found lots of young, hip leaders. This is Pastor, I forget his first name. It's Rich Wilkerson, big church in Miami, and he's a young, hip leader. Peter Ahn, young, hip leader, who is the pastor of a big church in New Jersey. This is Vanda. Vanda is not a young, hip leader. Vanda lives in Volga, South Dakota. Not a metropolis by any means. And Volga is a wonderful leader of young people who engages them well. This is Pastor James Brown. Jesse Brown, not James Brown. Pastor Brown is in the one in the middle. He is probably more hip than I am, but not necessarily a young, hip leader. This is Stretch. Stretch is one that we want to spend a little time on. His real name isn't Stretch, but that's his given name at this point, and is the name that he kind of goes by. When Stretch was 16 years old, Stretch got his driver's license. And of course, that means freedom to a lot of young people, right? 16-year-old gets his driver's license. His parents give him the keys to the family car and says, go take it out, take it for a spin. And Stretch thought, well, where am I going to go? Where's the first place that I want to go with the car that I was just given? And he loved church. So the first place that he came to was his church. And when he got to the church parking lot and he got out, the preschool director noticed that, hey, that's Stretch. His parents aren't with him. He's got his license. And so she went over to Stretch and said, Stretch, are you interested in doing a little work? And Stretch is like, well, yeah, I need to pay for gas. And so she's like, well, we need help in the afternoons locking up and cleaning up after our preschoolers. So do you want to work for us? And he said, yes. And so she said, well, stay right there. She went into her office. She got a key to the church. This is back in the days of a physical key. And she said, here, you'll need this to lock up the church. He just got his family keys, the keys to his family's car. Now he has the keys to the church. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, only the most important people in the church has the keys to the church. Little does he know, everybody really has a key to the church in most places. And then a few days later, his youth minister heard about Stretch beginning to work in the preschool area. And so he said, hey, Stretch, now that you're here a lot more, would you help me stock the drink machine? Again, this was back in the days where you got to stock your own drink machine. And Stretch said, yeah. His youth minister's like, well, I can't pay you like you're getting paid at the preschool. But what I can do is I'll give you all the Mountain Dews you want. Stretch is like, okay. So now he's got the keys to the family car, keys to the church, and now he has the keys to the drink machine in the church. Later on, he was sitting in the sanctuary of his church, much like this, and he heard, audibly or not, he heard the voice of God tell him, Stretch, you really like being here, don't you? And Stretch said, yeah, I really love it here. And later on, he became the pastor of that very church and is serving at that church even today. Keys to the car, keys in general, means a lot. It has a lot of meaning, can carry some power, right? Certainly, it also means a lot of responsibility. And what we found in our research is that this idea of leadership was really important to young people. But not just any kind of leadership, but what we refer to as key chain leadership. And it means it's not just having a youth ministry or student leadership team, although those are important and gives opportunities for our young people. But it's beyond that, just a youth ministry team. Keys in our research refers to capabilities, power, and access of leaders who carry the potential to empower young people. Keys isn't always the physical keys, right? It's not just this all the time. It's the capabilities, power, and access of leaders who can empower young people. There's 3 types of key chain leaders, or 3 types of leaders, I guess. First one is a keyless leader. Oftentimes, those are the ones who are young and do not have the opportunity to step into leadership, right? Those are the keyless leaders, but they have some key leadership capabilities, and they want to use them, but they don't have access. And then there are the key hoarding leaders, those who have the keys or the power or the access, and they like it, and they want to keep it, and they don't want to share it. And so there's some key hoarding leaders in churches. And then there are those key chain leaders, the leaders that we want to raise up to the top and say, this is the type of leadership that we desire in the church. When a young person turns 16, we don't just toss them the keys without them getting a license, right? We don't just toss them the keys to the car and say, just go figure it out. It'll be okay. Go on the freeway. Go on go on I-85 and it'll be okay. You'll figure it out. No, we make them go through driver's ed. We make them drive with their parents for a lot of hours that they have to log these days. And then they have to go pass a test, a written test and a driving test, in order for them to be able to have the leadership of owning or driving a car. But so often in churches, the way that we pass on leadership is, I am done. Here are the keys. You take it, because I don't want it anymore. And there's no passing on of leadership. It's really of giving up of leadership and tossing it to the other. Our Keychain leadership is focused on how do we pass on leadership in the church. And it really is based on mentoring. Again, begins with relationships, if you're going to mentor someone, but then you come alongside someone who might be younger and say, let me help you learn what it means to be a Sunday school teacher, a Sunday school director, or a volunteer in whatever ways. That it's not about just tossing someone the keys, but it's about helping the young person to have access, to unlock the potential that they have. But it requires that kind of relationship. So as we even talk about Keychain leadership right now, I want you to be thinking, who in this church needs access to keys? Not just physical keys, but who needs access to leadership? And be thinking about that one name, or two, or three. What we do know is that it's twofold. It's encouragement and it's support. Encouragement and support. That's what they need in church. I'm going to skip through that. Now the question becomes, how important is preaching in church? Because leadership, Jeremy just looked up, how important is preaching in church? This, again, we didn't go searching after this. This just kind of rose up from our research. And what we found is that preaching is important. How it's preached here in the sanctuary in front of people. I mean, Jeremy will tell you it is an incredible gift and an incredible responsibility to stand before you on a week-to-week basis to share something that God has given him to share with you. It's an incredible gift, but it's an incredible responsibility, right? And so preaching is really important. But what we found is that for young people, when asked what keeps people involved in their church, preaching was the 6th highest response. Sorry, Jeremy. As many hours as you put into your sermon, preaching fell into number 6 in this list. And it was only mentioned by 12% of the people. Interesting, right? Interesting. Here's what we know. Bad preaching, people don't want that. No one wants bad preaching, right? And you've got a good preacher, and he delivers a good sermon on a week-to-week basis, right? But great preaching isn't just the sure thing. So it's not up to Jeremy to bring people in. No matter how hard he works and how good he is up here, it's not going to be the only thing. Because guess what? The world has changed, and this is now accessible. You can download good preaching everywhere. Pandemic has shown us that you can watch and participate in whatever church you want to, because it's online. But what you can't do, what you can't download, is this idea of thoughtful mentoring. You can't download that. And that's what young people desire. Young people desire to learn and to grow under the leadership and under the tutelage, under the mentorship of adults in their lives. So here's an idea that we might think of is, what if it means that we empower young leaders to envision new doors with new set of keys? Remember that slide that said that the church is calibrated for a world that no longer exists? Maybe we need to begin thinking of, well, okay, what does that really mean? Do we have, can we help our young people to envision new ways, new doors, new keys to help strengthen the church? The enthusiasm of young people isn't the church's problem. It's the solution to this, that our young people, they are a solution, the solution. It's about us being together. Enthusiasm of young people is important to inject into every body, not only the body of Christ, but also just any organization, right? We're all looking for enthusiasm. So who's that one person that you're thinking of? I'm not letting you off the hook. Who's that one person? So Keychain leadership is about giving opportunities and access. So how do these findings confirm what you already knew about leadership in general, and what feels new or especially important for your context? Let's talk about it. What you just heard, is there anything that comes to your mind? I haven't known you to be shy yet. Don't be shy now.
The important responsibilities for us all.
Yeah, if you'll use that, because we are recording, so that will come through in the recording.
Sure. Is it? Okay. I think the important responsibilities for us all to assume leadership and not think it's the problem. Like, I think a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people talk about that, we're going to hire these 2 young dynamic ministers and they're going to wave a magic wand and it's going to fix all our problems. And that's just not how it works. And that top-down leadership, assuming that the staff is responsible for doing everything to make this church great, that's an unrealistic expectation, I think. I mean, it takes everybody, no matter your age, no matter, if you feel like I used to help with VBS when my kids were small. My kids aren't small anymore. I've raised my kids. I don't need to help with VBS. I mean, all the programs in this church need help from all generations. We can't, and we certainly can't pile it on the, a handful, double handful, whatever, of leaders that we have.
Tell me your name.
Amy. Amy Lawson.
Amy. My wife is Amy. So, Amy, you're going to get a free lunch with Jeremy and Tony. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Right on the money. That it takes all of us. Yeah. That you will not be able to hire your way out of this. There's no way that you're going to hire enough staff that you can think that we're going to just, if we just have the right people or right leadership, or we're talking about the church, all of us. Yeah. What else? One right there and then one right up here. Yep.
Are we on? Yeah, we're on. The unfortunate 80-20 rule comes into play all too often, both in life and in the church. However, what you're talking about is taking that 80-20 rule and turning it upside down, and it being 80-20, where 80% of the people in the church are involved in some way, shape, or form. Part of that comes into play where the staff needs to feel free to ask 100% of the people in the church to participate
Yeah.
and not try to do it all themselves.
Yeah. There you go. You've just been given permission to ask for help. Not that we haven't already, right? So, I mean, that's an important part, right? Is that we build the mentality and the attitude of we're all in it together. We're all part of the solution, and we need everybody to work together in this. Yeah.
As a church, as a whole, we have elderly, we have middle-aged, and our young people.
More experienced.
We'll
go
more
with that.
I'm more experienced, but I know that a lot of young kids, the first thing that almost comes out of their mouth that I talk to is that people don't accept how they look, how they dress, and I know as a person of older age, that even if somebody come in and they were homeless, we're all like, oh my God, what do we do with them? But we need to be more as how can we help him to know he could be accepted here?
Yeah, acceptance is one of those key things, right? And we're going to talk about in the next section, in empathy section, we're going to talk a lot about that, of the need for acceptance. So, yeah, absolutely.
Is it on? Hello?
Yep.
Oh, that's really loud. Yeah, just back to the leadership discussion, and we've been talking about how everybody needs to participate and that leadership needs to ask for help. And I just wanted to point out one other aspect that you referred to earlier with the Key Chain Hoarders.
Okay. Yeah.
That's a problem as well, that we need to address. With there's a large portion of our church in my generation that longs to support, that is denied that opportunity because of that category of problem.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yep. There's one, and then there's one back there, Rhonda.
The only thing I believe is that we have to recognize, just like Christy was saying, letting go of leadership. I will go out on a limb to say that hoarding leadership is easier than mentoring. It's easier for me to just do it than to explain to someone and let them fail, which is very important too, to allow them to fail. So if you are in a place of leadership, I would go out on a limb and say, if you're really embracing this mentoring idea, it's going to be harder.
Yeah.
Because it is not easy to teach. And it's really not easy to allow someone to fail. I think that's what good parenting is being to allow them to fail with a safety net. So I want to recognize the hardship of some of our leaders to let go of some of the stuff and know. And I do think that's one reason sometimes that you hoard as a leader, because it's just easier. Let me just do it myself.
Sometimes that is truly the case, right? And one of the things I want to mention here is that, again, I get to talk your language. It's for young people, it's not about filling a blank in nominating list or a committee and committee list, right? It's not about filling in those blanks. It's about knowing, remember the relational part, knowing the young people well enough to know what are their interests, what are their desires and their hopes, and then helping them to experience that here in the church. So it's not about just filling holes, and they can fill some holes, but it really is about knowing them well enough where you say, oh, you're interested in something? Let me help you express that here in the church. Let me help you, find a place of service. Yes, ma'am.
In thinking about relationships being the basis upon which all of this is built, I think that sometimes our church, we're real compartmentalized in the way we plan activities. I mean, if you're going to mentor young people and you learn their leadership skills, I mean, you don't find out about that at 11 o'clock service.
Right.
So, it seems like maybe we need to be much more intentional about planning activities that involve all the generations together. I mean, that it's an intentional. I know that, one of the things that some churches have done, like even on their mission trips, it's family mission trips. It's not the young people's going this way. You have senior activities, senior citizen activities, they're going this way, and then the family's in the middle. But it's planned way ahead. Families are able to, work their finances where they can participate in it. But there is a calendar, that they're knowing to budget, and by working together or playing together, that's when you get to know the gifts of young people.
That's right.
You just can't see it in a service on Sunday morning.
So let me explain a little bit of kind of our process of working with the Growing Younger Together committee. Is that we're currently in this assessment phase. So we're talking, we're having focus groups. We're listening to what you all are saying, and then part of our listening is also the online survey that you will get. It's 60 questions. It's multiple choice. It's not, it won't take you a long time. It may take you 15, 20 minutes to complete, but just long enough where you need to sit down and kind of think about it. And so we encourage you to take that, but all of that assessment is going to come, and then our role is going to be take that data and look at, all right, where are we strong and where are we weak? And then begin crafting goals and ways in which we're going to achieve those goals, and be listening to where God is leading us in that. And so that's what you're going to be seeing overall at the end of this process. It isn't just, I'm going to be here this weekend, I'm going to type up a nice 20-page report and say, good luck. That's not it. That's not it. I'm going to walk alongside of you all. We're gonna do this together, and we're gonna learn from each other, hear from each other, and then we're gonna say, all right, I think God is leading us in this path, in this direction, and this is the way we're going to get there together. So thank you for that. Yes.
Yes. Has streaming and downloading decreased church attendance? And if so, how do we get people to come back for the fellowship?
That's a great question. So certainly, pandemic has thrown a huge monkey wrench in this, right? Even pre-pandemic, certainly there were more engagement online. So I'm going to say something that you probably will not like. Is that may be the reality that we live in. Is that what the pandemic has done is just fast forward the time frame in which this was going to come. The online engagement was going to come, but so we can look at that as a problem, or we can look at that as an opportunity or part of the solution. So we can say, if they're not here, then they're not part of us. Or we can figure out, and this is where the church's growth edge is going to be, not just this church, but most churches, is right now, the online engagement is just one direction, right? It's people just watching what's happening out front. We're going to have to figure out how we're going to engage those that are watching and invite them into the fellowship. That's a huge learning curve for the church, but it's happened in other industries, and it can be done. It's just so counterintuitive for the church right now. And so that's a huge growth edge for churches of how are we going to engage the people that are, we can bemoan the fact that they're not coming or they're not here and they can't, and the relationship's not the same for sure. But we can say, well, if it's not going to be A, then there's no option B here. Or we can create some options that hopefully will lead to more engagement in option A, is what I'm trying to say. So hopefully that's something that's helpful. Again, that's a huge growth edge for most churches. Yes, ma'am.
We are in a community, many schools, many people coming in.
If you'll use the mic, that would be great.
We're in a community of many schools. We have North Georgia, we have 2 campuses here. We have Grinnell College, we have Lanier, we have the technical schools. We have great facilities right here with great possibilities and opportunities for us to bring young people. And in the past, we have had a lot of the young people from Grinnell, for instance, that became involved. We learned from them, they learned from us as well. And our children that are great leaders too, a lot of them are away now.
Right.
We've got some really wonderful kids that just graduated that are going to be here some, but not all the time. So I think that that's a mission thing for us and, an opportunity to do that.
There's definitely opportunities all around us. There's a question in the back.
Andy, it's been a few years now, but I'll share with you a moment that happened in this sanctuary that was eye-opening for me. It was a very young girl. Of course, everybody looks young now, but maybe 14, 15-ish. So there's this great divide between her and me anyway. But it illustrated even more about how I just did not know her well, because she was wearing in church that day a T-shirt, and a T-shirt probably sets off a few little flags. I'm old school. Church is a day you need to wear your best, and that's sort of how I was brought. But the T-shirt was said on it, "I love vampires." Now I thought, golly, what in the world is this young woman thinking? And I've thought about her a lot and how well or unwell she was received that day. And illustrated to me this, I don't know what I don't know. I should have been thrilled she was here, but I let her T-shirt influence my thoughts about her as an individual. And until this day, I try not to make that mistake again.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate that. And that segues nicely into our next core commitment. And I'm going to go straight into it without taking a break, and then we'll take a short break after that, because I think that this is an important one. Empathizing with young people today. What labels do we hear about young people? This is an open conversation at this point. What labels do we hear about young people today? Self-centered.
Entitled.
Entitled. Lazy. Whiners. Not wine, or that may, I don't know. Was that inappropriate? Dress code.
Stressed out.
Stressed out. Innovation. Compassionate.
The same thing our grandparents said about us and their grandparents said about them.
What grandparents say about the young people and their grandparents said about them of their generation. Yeah, I mean, it's a generational thing, right? It happens. Back in the day that Elvis was looked upon as the one that you shouldn't go and see or listen to. And sometimes we wish we could just listen to Elvis these days, right?
Easily influenced. I think they can swing one way or the other on any one given day, and I don't think they have some of the deep core commitments that some of us.
So, yeah, easily influenced, may not have the depth of commitment, all right? That's.
I think they care about our environment more than we do.
Care about the environment than some of the older generations. More accepting of people. Activists.
Unheard. Yeah, they're not.
Unheard? Yeah. Yep.
Way more informed.
Way more informed. Yeah.
Materialistic, not as materialistic.
Not as materialistic. Okay. So this is a little different than what I typically hear. What I typically hear is what we started with, right? Lazy, entitled, all the kind of the labels that the millennials get, right? We've heard that, right? Millennials, and do we even know who the millennials are these days, right? Just for context, just so that we're on the same page, millennials are now your 42-year-olds. Did you know that? Millennials range from like 25 to 42, depending on who you read, right? Gen Zers is the next one, is about 5 or 6 year olds all the way up to your 25-year-olds right now. So our current middle school, high school, and college students and post-college students are your Gen Zers. Millennials are your 40-year-olds. And then we're back down to Gen Alpha in the 0 to 5 age. We started with Gen X, and then we ran out of letters. And so we had to use Greek letters after that. So that's, yeah, I mean, typically I hear those words of how we describe our young people. And sure, there are some young people who live into those words. But there are many, many, many more young people who live into those positive words, the innovation, who care about the environment, who care about a lot of things, who are passionate and incredibly gifted. But we don't hear about that nearly as much as we hear about those labels that we tend to put on young people. And what we're finding is that there is a big generational gap, a relational gap between the generations, the different generations. And it goes both ways, right? The gap wasn't just created by the adults. Young people also need to kind of reach out to the other direction. But it really is about building empathy among the generations if we're going to truly have a relationship. It really is about empathy. And empathy means this: it's feeling with. It's this idea of sitting on a dock by with just the two of you, sharing time together, sharing life together, asking questions, hearing from each other. And then that last phrase, oh, that last phrase, not judging. Because if you truly have empathy, then you can't judge. It doesn't mean you don't correct when correction is needed. It doesn't mean you don't hold to your standard when standards are needed. But it means the story of that we just heard, right? Of judgment without getting to know the person. One of the top 2 reasons why young people don't come to church is that last phrase right there. Who wants to be a part of that, right? You wouldn't want to be a part of that. If you were judged, you wouldn't. Same thing for young people. Empathy is feeling with, or sitting on the curb together and not judging. Brene Brown, who's a psychologist and speaker, would say that empathy, it fuels connection, but sympathy drives disconnection. So it's not being just sympathetic, but it's truly walking in someone's shoes or wanting to walk in their shoes, trying to understand and trying to be someone who can take a perspective, try to look from someone else's angle, to see the world as the young people see the world, and trying to understand. Now, again, young people need to do the same with the older generations, right? But if we're waiting for young people to come to us, we're going to be waiting for a long time. As adults, I think we have the responsibility. We are the older ones. We have the responsibility to reach out and start building those relationships. Because we don't have the audio set up, and I meant to set the audio up, but I don't. This is a story of Natalie and Jasmine and Natalie. It's a story that I wanted to show, but I won't show because it won't come through in the audio. I don't think. Will it? Yeah, let's try it. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Discipleship is not a word that I heard growing up. No one said, "Oh, I disciple so and so." We just kind of did it.
It's coming out of there. I'm going to start that over. It's going to come out of the.
Discipleship was not a word that I heard growing up. No one said, "Oh, I disciple so and so." We just kind of did it. The Lord was pushing me to step out and essentially started learning the message of discipleship. Kind of felt like a burning bush experience where the Lord was like, it's time to start passing that on. So the next question is like, oh, well, great. To who?
My family had come to fellowship when I was in the 7th grade, and they put me in a youth group. And I didn't like youth group because I'm an old church. I was the only black kid in my youth group. I didn't want to feel singled out. I had the worst attitude. I didn't want to be there.
We were all in this tiny room, 4 middle school, high school girls, and I barely know any of them. I thought, all right, there could be a divine appointment in this room. So I'm just going to keep praying, and I'm going to wait. I'm going to let God speak. And I kid you not, there was one in the room who was like, not having anything artificial.
And she sat beside me, and I was like, who is this woman? Like, why is she here? Like, she's 20-something, and she keeps talking to us and wants to be like our Sunday school teacher, but it's not even Sunday school. But she, like, had this gentle, like, persistence about her that I didn't notice.
That night, I just started dreaming of this young girl. Sometimes we were going on walks. Sometimes we were going on runs. Sometimes we were sitting around at a table, and I thought, okay, I'm going to ask her to coffee because 13-year-olds like coffee.
I was 13, 14, didn't drink coffee. I was like, I mean, I guess. I have nothing else to do. Are you going to pick me up?
I knew it was an obedient move. I want to have it all together, but Lord, I don't know what's next. I'm sitting at coffee with a 13-year-old. I don't know what to say. He's like, just pursue an honest conversation. Just talk to her.
I remember she asked me a question about like someone's relationship in the youth group. I think they're gonna break up. And usually if I talk to an adult like that about another adult, the adult would say like, well, you don't know anything, like you're just a little girl, or like that's rude, how do you know? But she didn't say that to me. She kind of had a conversation with me about what I had just said, and it wasn't a conversation of like correction, it was just a conversation between a person and a person. I mean, when you're 13 and you're in school and you have parents and everyone's older than you and telling you what to do, but then this one person comes into your life and like, here's what you say. Like, I'm really emotional, but that like melted my heart. And I think that gave like she could have said anything to me after that and I would have hurt her, so. I mean, she calls me her sister, and we're sisters.
People are not projects. We started sitting down and meeting. We were for sure going to see each other on Sundays, but all of a sudden, a project didn't emerge. There wasn't this point where I go, okay, I'm discipling you and you're my disciple. It expanded what I really think that God meant for discipleship to be. This has been the one thing where I feel that I've been blessed in every way. She's a gift. She's a little sister. It's just meant the world to me.
See people as people. Don't come with all the answers and all the help, but have a conversation with someone and taking things slow and looking at people as if they're royalty, because they are. Treat people like people, like they're your friend, and actually mean it in your heart.
There's a lot to glean from that short interview, but one of the things that really stands out is this: that people are not projects. You're not a project to fix. I'm not a project to fix. And young people are not projects to fix. That people are people, and we're called to love and be in relationship with one another. And so if we enter into a relationship thinking, I've got to fix you, or I got to do something to make you better, that's not what our young people are looking for. Our young people are looking for just relationships. Relationships that they can share with people of all ages. People of all ages. And for our young people, being seen is so close to being loved that for an average person, it's the same. To be seen as people and not as a caricature of a person, or not as a label as they walk into a room, not having preconceived notions. So we can't assume. We can't assume that every generation knows what they're doing or thinks that they have it right. Because in my generation in the 80s, this is what I thought looked good. The Gen Xers thought that this was it. Problem is that in the decades that we live, in our teens and our 20s, it isn't the same decade that our young people today are experiencing. So here's an idea for us, is that we take out the phrase out of our lexicon, out of the words that we use, when I was your age. Anytime that we're talking with young people, we want to take that phrase out. Because oftentimes, 95% of the time that when we start with that phrase, we're often about to say something that is trying to fix something that's wrong today. 95% of the time, right? And so encourage us to maybe rethink how we choose our words in there, because growing up, even in the 80s, for me, in the 90s, is so different than 2021. Similar issues, but a different context, an entirely different context. Reality for young adults. So we're talking about now those in, let's say, in their 20s, okay? Reality for young adults. Remember this idea of sharing the truth here. For young adults, we need to add plus 5 years to a lot of things for them. It's plus 5. When I was growing up, and when many of you were growing up, it went in this order: children, youth, college, and you became young marrieds right after college, right? For some of you, you may have gotten married even before that, right? As you finished up high school. But recently, more recently, it follows this direction. Well, here's the reality of today, is that there's plus 5 years in between college and this idea of not as quite as young marrieds anymore. Here's what I mean by that. It's that today, our young adults are less likely to get married right after college. The average age of first marriage for young people today is 27, 28 years old. So there's a whole lot of things that can happen from 22 to 27 or 28, right? I got married at 22, didn't know what I was doing. Thankfully, Amy put up with me. But our young people today, young adults, are not getting married as early, right? Even to the fact that they're dating less. Statistics say that less young adults are even dating today. So you got the plus 5 years, then you've got options. Now, options sound like a great thing. In my lifetime, and when I was growing up, high school, college, job, marriage, kids. That was the expectation. Don't break that order, right? You cannot break that order. It's high school, college, job, marriage, and then we have kids. The reality of today's young people looks more like this. It looks more like that, where it seems like options sound so good, but options also cause a whole lot of frustration, a whole lot of anxiety. And honestly, if you ask young adults today, they would love for it to be linear all over again, where it's pretty simple of the next step. But it's not that way anymore. It's not that way anymore. And we can think about kind of the morality or the however way you want to look at it, but this is the fact of the matter of this is our young adults' world today. And so not only are there the 5 years and the options, but then now there's less relational support. Here's what I mean by that. 1/3 of young adults feel cared for, which means that 2/3 do not feel cared for. One-third of the young adults feel believed in. And again, that means 66% of them do not feel believed in. And even though we are the most connected of any time in our generation or in our lifetime, that we're more connected than ever together because of this in our pockets, it's the loneliest of all generations. I was listening to a podcast this morning, and the amount of stress and anxiety and the loneliness that our young people feel today, and especially in the pandemic, that has just absolutely skyrocketed. That our young people, 1 out of 4, and that's higher now in this amidst of the pandemic, feels lonely and isolated. And so you take the 5 years, you take all the options, it sounds great, but it's not so much great in reality. You take less relational support, meaning that there's less adults in their lives who are supporting them and providing the guidance and the mentoring and the relationships they need. That equates to today's 28 feeling like the old 18. That today's 28-year-old is often compared to the 18-year-old of yesteryears. And that's hard. You ask every young person, and they don't necessarily love the fact that there's uncertainty in their next step. They would love to come out of college and begin their career. But the reality is today, you come out of college with an undergraduate degree and you can't compete in the job market today with that. And thus you continue on to graduate school. And so now you're 25 years old coming out of college, oftentimes. And then maybe even at that point, maybe you can compete in the job market. Sometimes you got to then go do an internship in order to get experience. And so now you're at 26 or 27-year-old coming out, and just maybe, if you're lucky, beginning your career in the chosen field. And oftentimes we were 18 to 22, and we were already starting in our field. And so our young people, our young adults, it's not easy for them. It's difficult. And so without the relationships in the church, relationships with adults, it's no wonder that 2 out of 3 young adults drop out of church between ages of 18 to 23. So top 5 reasons, David Letterman style, of why they leave church. 1, they just move away, which happens. That's part of life. They go off to college and then they don't come back. So they move away. That's the reality. Number 2, feeling judged, hypocritical people. Well, we're all broken people. We're part of the body of Christ, but we're all broken. But the judgmentalism that is often found in churches are driving young people away. They feel disconnected. They feel disconnected. I'll stop here and I'll get on my soapbox for just a second. Longtime youth minister, 20 years of serving youth ministry in local churches like First Gainesville. Okay? So I was part of this growing, and I fed this in so many ways. We now have 40 years of data where we started to have professionalized youth ministry. It really began in most churches back in the 70s, and we began to have youth ministers as staff ministers of the church. So we did it out of the goodness of our hearts. We loved our young people, we as the Big C Church loved our young people, so we wanted our young people to have their own pastor so that they can relate to someone, right? We loved our young people so much, we wanted them to have their own space where they could be together. You all have a beautiful space for your young people, and we praise God for that, but most churches, it's the basement or the attic of the church that we take and turn that into the youth space. We loved our young people so much that we even gave them part of the budget. And we loved our young people so much that we said, all right, you volunteers, you go with our young people so that they don't tear anything up. What we failed to do was stay connected to our young people. Here's the result of that. We sometimes call that the one-eared Mickey Mouse syndrome. Here's the church, and here's the youth ministry of the church, one ear. Barely connected to the church, but never integrated back into the church. So it's this grand experiment that we've had. Now, I'm not saying that we should do away with youth ministry. Please don't hear me say that, right? But what we've got to figure out is how do we bring youth ministry back into the life of the church? That it doesn't happen on an island over here. Because remember the graduation service that we had? And the statistic that 1 out of every 2 are probably going to walk away from their faith within the first 18 months of graduation? Remember that? It's oftentimes because we celebrate them and they walk off the stage and they might go out the back or the front and they literally feel like they're graduating from church. Because their only experience of church was children's ministry and youth ministry. And I'm looking at my youth choir ministry. But then we literally say, you're too old to be in youth ministry anymore. And they get the sense in some ways, we don't say that, but the sense is that they literally have graduated from church. Because oftentimes they don't have relationships with the body that's gathered here this morning. Very little relationships. And so there's nothing to bring them back to the church where they have connections. Their graduating class may be all scattered, and if they ever come back and they feel like, this doesn't feel the same anymore. So they feel like they're graduating from church. So they feel disconnected. Again, we did not do that intentionally as a church, but that's been the result of what we've seen. Top 5 reasons. I said earlier that they need space to be able to talk about important topics. And one of the reasons why they leave is they either disagree politically, and it does happen on social issues. But more than that, our research says that they can disagree, but they need safe space to be able to talk about it. And then the fact of the matter is there's work that gets in the way. Hate it when that happens. There's work that gets in the way. Oftentimes our young adults are having to work multiple jobs to put it all together. And so if you work multiple jobs, then sometimes it's really hard to stay connected to the church. Almost finished here. These are 3 universal questions that we all ask ourselves. We ask it of ourselves when we have gone through different stages of life. Whether it's when we went off to college, whether it's when we switched jobs, whether when we moved to a different city, when we retired from our work, or when we lost a spouse at some point, we're asking ourselves, who am I? Where do I fit? What difference can I make? We're asking ourselves those questions. How will my life matter? And with some maturity and with some guidance, we answer those. It's not a. It isn't as stressful for us as adults to answer those questions. But for young people, it becomes this kind of always in the back of their minds. It's in a rolling boil is what we sometimes refer it as. It's always there for them. And it causes a lot of stress, and it causes a lot of anxiety. And oftentimes, they come up with false answers. Answers that are filled with conditions. Who am I? I am whatever others want me to be. And it has some conditions. Where do I fit? I belong if I can do something for somebody. How will my life matter? I matter when I'm needed, or when, again, I can do something for someone. None of those things are necessarily bad, but I think we know that there are better answers that we can give our young people. That we hope that their answers are these answers that we have in the church, that who am I? I am enough because I am a son or a daughter in Christ. That God loves me no matter who I am. That God loves and cares for me. There's nothing that I can do to make God love me anymore. There's no amount of good things that I can do to make God love me anymore. Or there's no amount of bad things that I can do to make God love me any less. That God just loves me. There's no conditions. Where do I fit? I belong with God's people in the body of Christ, that we are here where we belong in this body. How will my life matter? I matter because I'm invited to God's greater story. That God has given us a mission in the great commandment to love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations. That God has given us the story to live in. And we truly believe that the better story always wins. The better story always wins. But we've got to share that better story with our young people and with our older people and with our community. Some practical things that I would want you to walk away with today. We don't judge, we journey with. If we can just kind of have that in our minds, that we don't judge, we journey with. We just want to be a part of our young people's lives. We mentor them, we guide them, we support them. Another skill that I want you to take away with you today is I told you to not use the words or not start a sentence with, when I was your age. I want you to add these 3 words to your vocabulary to tell me more. Anytime you're talking with young people, when you get the one-word answer, as you inevitably will get, you respond with, well, tell me more about that. What do you mean? Tell me more. Tell me more. One church took it really seriously. The church in Tulsa said, all right, we want all of our people to understand this, so we're going to put it on the walls of the church. Going down a hallway where everybody walked down, they literally drew a mural that said, tell me more. I wonder, where do young people show up in your calendars? Do they show up in your calendars? Because it's all of our roles. It's all of us together. So it's time. I just went a long time just talking. So I'd love to hear about your questions. But before we do that, let's take a 10-minute break. And then we'll have 30 minutes to kind of ask some questions at the end. But I know that we've been sitting for a long time. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll start back at 11:30. It's 11:18 right now.